do action. I'm going to introduce our two speakers. I'm going to ask each speaker to talk for about 15 minutes, and then whatever time we have left, we'll devote to Q&A. Okay, and I will check the meeting chat and look for signals that people want to be called on as the evening goes on. Okay, introductions. First, Carmine Palumbo is a professor of English at East Georgia State College in Swainsboro, where he has taught and served as an academic administrator for nearly 2 decades. He was previously chair of humanities at Middle Georgia College in Cochran. He holds a PhD in American literature and folklore from the University of Louisiana, where it began his interest in the life and work of the late New Orleans author John Kennedy Toole, who taught at the University of Louisiana for several years prior to the posthumous publication of his Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, A Confederacy of Dunces. Palumbo lives in Swainsboro with his wife and 2 children. Our second speaker will be Jack Love, whose wife is going to be having a baby soon. He is in the English department at Texas A&M University, where he's a PhD student. He studies late 19th to mid 20th century American literature with a specific focus on the American South, religion, and the environment. His topic of discussion today looks at the religion of O'Connor's Wiseblood through the paradigm of Dwight MacDonald's mass cult and mid-cult. A forthcoming article on the topic will be published in the March 2024 issue of Christianity and Literature. Is it out yet? No, not yet. Okay.
Not yet. It should be out
soon. Okay. We'll have to get the details on that. Okay. Both of these folks were participants in the NEH Summer Institute at Georgia College, and we're delighted to share with the world live and on tape some of the results of their work. So I will now turn it over to Carmine and ask you to unmute yourself and talk away.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, Bruce. I'm speechless. And I am really excited to be here. So thank you for inviting me. This comes from, our first meeting at the beginning of the Institute, that sort of first consultation that we have. And I was with you, Bruce, and you were very patient as I told you all about my interest in John Kennedy Toole and Flannery O'Connor. And you mentioned that there was one article that you were aware of that had dealt with Flannery O'Connor and John Kennedy Toole. So I didn't get to it during the Institute, but I feel like I'm finally running that lead to ground here with my presentation tonight. So this one is called right now, it's really a work in progress, so please forgive me. It's called Uncanny Coincidence, Searching for Ignatius Riley in the Heathen Manuscripts. So thank you again for inviting me to speak this evening after participating in the NEH Summer Institute last summer in Milledgeville, and now to be included in this esteemed company. I am truly standing on the shoulders of giants. Before I begin, I'd like to briefly honor the late John Wharton Lowe, who took the time this summer to meet with me and to offer suggestions about this work that I've been doing on John Kennedy Toole and Flannery O'Connor. Dr. Lowe was devoted to Louisiana art and culture, and he clearly loved the Confederacy of Dunces. He was unable to say the words pyloric valve without making himself laugh. His passing last year saddened me greatly and serves as one of the larger things of what I'll be sharing with you this evening, which is the question of what might have been. I'll be looking at 2 works, The Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy Toole and Why the Heathen Rage by Flannery O'Connor. One published, the other sort of published, with the subtext of what might these 2 talented authors have created and what future works would have clarified had not their lives been cut short. O'Connor by terminal illness and Toole by suicide. I feel obligated to point out that the references to the heathen manuscripts refer to those held in the collection of Georgia College and State University. I have not yet read the published version of Heathen, so I'm unable to reference that text for context or documentation purposes. The late New Orleans author John Kennedy Toole is implicitly associated with Flannery O'Connor and has been since the publication of his Pulitzer Prize winning novel, A Confederacy of Dunces, in 1980. There are several reasons why these two authors are often held in the same frame. Both are Southern Catholics from what many call the Deep South. Both used dark humor and employed grotesque characters to explore similar concepts. Both were experts at mimicry, finding humor in the people they loved and interacted with every day. My interest lately, as some of you may know, has been the last hours of John Kennedy Toole's life, when he may or may not have visited Milledgeville, as his mother, Thelma, claimed after his death, leaving us a great mystery of Southern literature. But my interest this evening is Toole's iconic character, Ignatius Riley, the haughty, hapless, sometimes lovable New Orleans native, who, to say the least, is having trouble finding a place for himself in late 1960s American life. After the novel was published with the help of Walker Percy and won the Pulitzer Prize in 1980, people who knew Toole naturally speculated on which member of his group of friends was the inspiration for the Ignatius Riley character. Focus quickly landed on Robert Byrne, known as Bob or Bobby to his friends, who had been a close friend of Toole's for many years. Because of the close-knit fabric of family relationships in New Orleans, the thoroughly uptown Bob Byrne had known the Toole family, especially Toole's eccentric mother Thelma, for many years. As Byrne explained in a 1995 interview, I knew Thelma almost all my life in a way. My aunt taught Ken in second grade or first grade, I forget which, at McDonough School, and she used to say, Thelma Toole gives me the pip. When John Kennedy Toole, Ken, or Kenny to his friends landed in Lafayette, Louisiana with a teaching appointment in 1959, the two New Orleans expatriates easily fell in with one another, moved in the same circle of friends, and were often seen on campus together. Byrne, a classics professor at what was known at the time as Southwestern Louisiana Institute, was an easy solution for the Ignatius Riley mystery. Anyone familiar with Byrne's Chaucer class knew that he covered Chaucer's translation of the Consolation of Philosophy by the Christian martyr Boethius, who died in 524. A confirmed bachelor, he lived a monk-like existence, caring for an extensive garden behind his little house on Adrian Street in Lafayette. His personal style was notoriously eclectic, and his lofty uptown New Orleans accent and similarly dignified demeanor was famous among students and faculty. When asked about Confederacy, Byrne said, no, I didn't read the book until everybody else had read it. Finally, people insisted I read it, and somebody finally gave me a copy. When asked if he believes he could have been the inspiration for the Riley character, and who would want to be the inspiration for the Ignatius Riley, Byrne demurs and points out that there are others in Toole's orbit who are more likely suspects, notably another Southwestern Louisiana professor named Maurice Duquesne. At the same time, he does acknowledge some similarities. According to Byrne, I had a pair of British tan, which are really orange pants. When it got cold, I would wear those. I had a green corduroy shirt and a red corduroy coat and blue wool socks. And then I had the hat that he makes fun of. If you know the cover of the book, there's the hat. It actually had a brim. It was a little rain hat that had ear flaps. Although it's interesting to speculate which person among his group of friends in New Orleans and Lafayette may have been the true inspiration for the character, the true lodestar of Toole's work was always Flannery O'Connor. Toole's friend Bob Byrne was a dignified person, a serious professor, a respected friend and colleague to many. There were and still are, I hope, many humorous stories about him passed around in the faculty lounge, but he was not a slob extraordinary, a mad Oliver Hardy, a fat Don Quixote, a perverse Thomas Aquinas rolled into one, as Walker Percy describes Ignatius Riley in his foreword to the novel. Even a cursory consideration of the character Ignatius Riley yields some obvious parallels to well-known O'Connor characters, like the poor, inexperienced Hulga stomping about her mother's house in a 6-year-old skirt and a yellow sweatshirt with a faded cowboy horse embossed on it, in Good Country People from the Goodman collection. We could certainly imagine Ignatius in a doctor's waiting room with Mrs. Turpin, like the scowling, acne-scarred Mary Grace, whose poor mother has to explain Mary Grace goes to Wesley College in Massachusetts, and in the summer she just keeps right on studying, just reads all the time, a real bookworm. I think she ought to get out and have some fun. We see a bit of Ignatius and Julian from Everything That Rises, who withdraws into a, quote, a kind of mental bubble in which he established himself when he could not bear to be part of what was going on around him. When the mother that he is barely able to tolerate agrees with the stranger on the bus who asserts selling typewriters is close to writing, he can go from one to another. In nearly every story in the collection, intelligence is a corrupting influence, creating a chasm between a child and a parent, between the child and their responsibilities to the parent. The only thing the Greenleaf boys have in common was that neither of them cared what happened on the farm their mother struggles to run. Schofield was a business type and Wesley was an intellectual. The enduring chill may well be about Toole's return from may as well be about Toole's return from his failed journey to New York and failure to meet Robert Gottlieb about his unpublished novel, and Toole's slow descent into madness as much as it is about O'Connor's flare-up of lupus on her return from Connecticut to Georgia. Discovering O'Connor's influence on Toole's work in published works that he most likely had read is one thing, but to find unlikely similarities between Toole's novel and a work that was never published in his lifetime is extraordinary and naturally leads one to wonder. The strongest connection between the work of the two authors, O'Connor and Toole, may perhaps reside with O'Connor's unpublished novel, Why Are the Heathen Rage? As Bruce Gentry points out, in What Kind of Novel Can Be Made of Flannery O'Connor's Heathen Manuscript from the Better to See You With collection, one way to read Heathen, then, is to see it as a continuation of the plot about the weakened but still living main character of The Enduring Chill. He continues, like the main character in Enduring Chill, Walter is shocked to think that he's a Christian and to indict himself as a bad one. And he is unsure of what to do with his belief. In draft after draft of the planned novel, Walter also does not know what to do with his family, all of whom are alive, his father, mother, and sister. A major challenge would be for Walter to figure out how to manage the black workers on the farm. Instead of taking direct action concerning his family or the farm, Walter reads, especially books about medieval theology, which happens also to be Ignatius Riley's area of interest, and writes bizarre letters to newspapers and, more significantly, letters to complete strangers, letters intended primarily to satirize the recipients. It's no surprise that critic Marion Burns describes the Heathen manuscripts as uncannily and coincidentally comparable to John Kennedy Toole's A Confederacy of Dunces. According to Burns, it's interesting to observe the appearance in print of another fictional figure who was almost lost to the public, that of Ignatius J. Riley in John Kennedy Toole's posthumously published novel, A Confederacy of Dunces. There are many similarities of characterization between Toole's mother and son and O'Connor's families, such as those in Everything That Rises Must Converge, Greenleaf, or The Comforts of Home, all of whom could be direct ancestors of Mrs. Riley and Ignatius in Toole's book. There are further incidental similarities between The Confederacy of Dunces and Why Are the Heathen Rage? For example, Ignatius's correspondence with Myrna Minkoff in New York is a device remarkably like Walter's correspondence. To illustrate this point, note the following passage from the Heathen manuscript. O'Connor writes, as a sort of literary exercise, Walter wrote letters to people he did not know. Whatever their fantastic viewpoint or occupation, he professed himself enthusiastically about it. Occasionally, when a correspondence got out of hand or when he got tired of the correspondent, he wrote deceased across the letter he had just received and put it back in the mail. His correspondence with Mrs. Gibbs was out of hand and had been from the first, but he had not been able to bring himself to write deceased across one of her letters. Walter never wrote anyone he considered intelligent or particularly honest. For 3 months, he had written a woman poet whose ratty verse he could not abide, letters of such overwhelming praise that she began sending him a poem each day. For she wrote one every night before she went to bed. When she learned of his death, she composed a eulogy to a friend never seen and sent it as a condolence to the family. Compare this to a passage from Confederacy where Ignatius writes to Myrna. Toole writes, Beloved Myrna, I have received your offensive communication. Do you seriously think that I am interested in your tawdry encounters with such subhumans as folk singers? In every letter of yours, I seem to find some reference to the sleaziness of your personal life. Please confine yourself to discussing issues and such. Thereby, you will at least avoid obscenity and offense. As Burns points out, both women, Myrna and Sarah, represent Weltanschauung, alien to men, living among liberals in the North's most sophisticated city. They're saturated with modern ideology, while Ignatius and Walter cling to an orthodox medieval worldview. The most arresting coincidence between the two works is this shared philosophy of the two main figures. Comparing Heathen's Walter to the protagonist of O'Connor's other two novels, Marion Burns opines that the protagonist of Heathen, Walter Tillman, will find Christ just like the other two heroes, but in this case, his belief is that of a distinctly pre-Reformation Christianity. That's to say that whereas Hazel Motes and Marion Tarwater were contemporary Southern Protestants, this time O'Connor's hero, while superficially disaffected Southerner and an atheist, is in essence a European medieval Catholic. Hayes turned out to be a Christian martyr. Tarwater turned out to be a Christian prophet. Walter, as it implied, will turn out to be a Christian monk. If this were the case, it would be a departure from O'Connor's previous work. There are certainly no monks in her previous works. It could be that this new interest in pre-Reformation Christianity is a result of the pilgrimage to Lourdes that she undertook with Regina in 1958, which would be about 4 years before she was working on this manuscript. During that 2.5 week journey, O'Connor spent several days with the Fitzgeralds in Levanto on the Italian Riviera, location of several notable religious sites, including the Clarissa Monastery, the Convento Annunziata, and the ruins of the San Antonio del Mesco, one of the early monasteries of the Augustinians, before rejoining the group from Savannah and continuing on to Lourdes and Rome, attending a general audience at St. Peter's, and afterwards personally being greeted by Pope Pius XII. Burns continues, as the imagery of monasticism informs the manuscript of Heathen, so does the suggestion of medievalism in Walter's name. One thinks of Walter the Penniless of the 11th century, Hubert Walter, Archbishop of Canterbury, and Walter of Coutances, both in the 12th century, or Walter of Coventry in the 13th, all of them priests, and the last a monk and friar. Noting yet another parallel, Toole selects the name of the 15th century religious figure Saint Ignatius of Loyola, founder of the Jesuits and patron saint of Loyola University, which was situated a stone's throw from the house on Hampson Street where he was living with his parents at the time of his suicide. We know that these two Southern authors were working on novels that were uncannily similar at the end of their short lives. We do not know what they may have written or how these works would have changed over time. We do know that Toole's overall body of work was immeasurably influenced by O'Connor, but other than the small excerpt of Heathen that was published in Esquire in 1963, which only introduces the Walter character, it's not possible that he could have known anything more about the plans for the novel. Toole's book was not rediscovered until 1976, many years after O'Connor's death, so how they could have been working on similar comic novels with similar comic themes at the exact time is simply unknowable. Sorry, I just didn't have a conclusion. But anyway, that's what I've got, and I appreciate you giving me a place to read it. So thank you.
All right, so I know how to unmute. Thank you, Carmen. Okay, now we'll hand it over to Jack Love.
Thank you, Bruce. Thanks, Bruce, for the introduction, and thank you, Carmen, for that great presentation. Before I get started, I also want to thank Tom Haddix and the NEH Institute. The project that I am working on and am reading tonight comes out of a graduate class that I took at the University of Tennessee, where we had the opportunity to read Wise Blood and Dwight MacDonald in Tom Haddix's class. So thank you for all your support and help, Tom. And then, of course, the NEH Institute offered me the opportunity to kind of refine and revise this idea in many ways. So thank you both for that. So my presentation is titled Hazel Motes and Mid-Cold Religion in Flannery O'Connor's Wise Blood. So Flannery O'Connor's first novel, Wise Blood, has been evaluated many times since its publication for its critique of consumerism, modernity, and American Christianity. While this has been discussed from many perspectives by many different scholars, there is one peculiar connection that O'Connor has to a contemporary author and critic of her time. Namely, her criticism of modern Christianity can be tied to Dwight MacDonald's definition of mass cult and mid-cult. Since O'Connor was a Catholic novelist from the American South, her own views vastly differ from Dwight MacDonald, who was a self-professed Marxist critic from New York City. Nonetheless, the mass cult, mid-cult paradigm aligns with O'Connor's own religious attitudes. Both O'Connor and MacDonald see the infiltration of American mass culture and religion and art as a corruptive influence that further isolates people from meaningful community. For O'Connor specifically, of course, mid-cult religion then also hinders people from obtaining redemption. MacDonald defines mass cult as an anti-art form that is essentially a standardized cultural product meant to appeal to the widest possible audience. It does not meet the individual needs of either the producer or the consumer, but instead promotes a standardized commodity that is always the exact same. In defining art, MacDonald adopts William Wordsworth's romantic conception of the poet that he lays out in preface to Lyrical Ballads. All art, from poetry to painting, according to Wordsworth, should be, quote, a man speaking to men, a man pleased with his own passions and volitions, and one who rejoices more than other men in the spirit of life that is in him, end quote. Mass cult does the exact opposite. According to MacDonald, quote, it is fabricated by technicians hired by businessmen, end quote. Unlike art, mass cult is a product typical of large business conglomerates in the entertainment industry set on obtaining profit above all other things. Mid-cult, on the other hand, is a deceptive form of mass cult. For MacDonald, it, quote, has the essential qualities of mass cult, but it decently covers them with the cultural fig leaf, end quote. In other words, it pretends to be high art, that's what MacDonald would say, when it is only another form of mass cult cultural production. Mid-cult pretends to be artistic for art's sake when it really is only interested in profit and praise. With mass cult, the trick is plain. Mid-cult is often identified as true pieces of art by those who evaluate it, the critics. Dwight MacDonald spent most of his critical career analyzing cultural products before labeling them as mass cult, mid-cult, or high art. For instance, MacDonald deems Norman Rockwell paintings as mid-cult art for pretending to possess artistic pedigree when actually just catering to American nationalism. He considers Ernest Hemingway's late works mid-cult because they often tell a reader how to feel or what to think. At times, MacDonald's criticism is overtly Marxist in orientation, but his mass cult, mid-cult paradigm still serves as a useful strain of thought when studying American post-war culture of the 20th century. Indeed, his definition of mid-cult relates to O'Connor's main criticism of post-World War II Christianity and wise blood. Mid-cult Christianity, or mid-cult religion, as I call it, pretends to be the real version of the religion, according to O'Connor. As such, it falsely professes to provide all the same aspects of a real Christianity: redemption, human connection, etc. MacDonald's mid-cult has 4 characteristics: universal types, veneration for American or Western values, the built-in reaction, and a certain contempt for intellectualism. Though he applies these types to art, we can also see these same characteristics in the religion of Hoover Schultz and the ethical advice of Mary Brittle in Wise Blood. At first glance, Hoover Schultz's preaching seems to be a type of mass cult religion. After all, he is clearly interested in profit. He tells Hayes towards the end of the novel that he can get profits for peanuts, for instance. Yet, an overtly mass cult religion cannot work because it does not mask its intent to generate profit. To be a successful preacher, Schultz must convince his audience that he can give them something that they need. Schultz attracts a crowd of people with his rhetoric where Hayes himself could not gain the attention of anyone. As he speaks with Hayes after the spirit preaching scene in Wise Blood, he notes, quote, "I was on the radio for 3 years with a program that gives real religious experiences to the whole family," end quote. Calling himself an artist type, Schultz advises Hayes, quote, "If you want to get anywheres in religion, you got to keep it sweet," end quote. His association with a mode of mass cultural appeal denotes what he represents in the novel. Even calling himself an artist type rather than an artist correlates with MacDonald's own claim that mass cult and mid-cult is an anti-art. Schultz's own mid-cult performance of religion mostly achieves success through its emphasis on a certain universality that derives from individuality. As he preaches to the crowd, he says, quote, "You can sit at home and interpret your own Bible however you feel in your heart it ought to be interpreted." Shortly after, Schultz argues that all people have a bundle of helpless sweetness inside of them. Rather than leaving that sweetness trapped inside oneself, Schultz tells the crowd that they can all release their inner self by simply paying $1 to his newfound church. These comments at once portray the mid-cult tendency to universality and anti-intellectual individuality. While Catholic theology, of course, maintains a universalism across humankind, it is vastly different from that of mid-cult Christianity. In Schultz's religion, the universality lies in the allowed difference in biblical interpretation. Each person can read the same passage from the Bible and make their own meaning out of the text. At the same time, no priest, minister, pastor, or other religious expert can authoritatively explain its meaning. What matters most is what the text means to each person. Later, Schultz even criticizes Hayes for being one of those intellectuals who has, quote, nothing to show for what he's saying, end quote. Mid-cult Christianity shifts religious authority from a church or from the church inward to the individual, reconstructing doctrines into a sort of sentimentalism that favors human emotions over any sort of concrete doctrine. O'Connor herself defines sentimentality as, quote, escaping of the process of redemption in its concrete reality and an early arrival at a mock state of innocence, which strongly suggests its opposite, end quote. Many critics, including Brian Abel Reagan, assert that O'Connor was always attacking a modern sentimental view of religion. Reagan continues by writing, quote, Americans tend to see religion as something sweet, uplifting, and optimistic. Schultz plays into this American view of religion, universalizing it as something that anyone can grasp based upon their own interpretation rather than any doctrine or church-wide belief. In a separate instance, the built-in reaction of mid-cult Christianity emerges as Hayes and Sabbath Lily discuss whether bastards can enter the kingdom of heaven. The built-in reaction, according to MacDonald, is when an artistic work tells the reader how to think or feel rather than simply evoking these things in the work itself. He would call this mid-cult rather than high art as a result. In the scene in Wise Blood, Sabbath tells Hayes she has written an advice columnist named Mary Brittle with the question, quote, do you think I should neck or not, end quote. Sabbath understands that necking is wrong according to Christianity, but she is a bastard and shall not enter the kingdom of heaven anyway. The advice columnist's response also speaks to the mid-cult nature of the religion. Brittle responds, quote, dear Sabbath, light necking is acceptable, but I think your real problem is one of adjustment to the modern world. Perhaps you ought to re-examine your religious values to see if they meet your needs in life. A religious experience can be a beautiful addition to living if you put it in the proper perspective and do not let it warp you. Read some books on ethical culture, end quote. The advice provided is not based upon any sort of religious doctrine. Rather, Mary Brittle assumes what Sabbath Lily wants to hear and answers accordingly. Writing on the built-in reaction in mid-cult art, Dwight MacDonald claims, quote, it is impossible not to identify the emotion an artist wants to arouse, end quote. In other words, mid-cult cultural products do not provide the audience with the freedom to emotionally react however they see fit. The reverse is true of the mid-cult religion in the advice column scene. Ethical experts like Mary Brittle react to Sabbath Lily's question by providing her with the most agreeable answer. Indeed, after Sabbath receives the advice, she writes back, dear Mary, what I really want to know is, should I go the whole hog or not? Though she does not relay Mary's answer to Hayes, the columnist most likely answered in a similar manner, if at all. John Lance Bacon, tying the two together, that is Schultz and Brittle, suggests that Schultz follows the same strategy as Mary Brittle while street preaching. By keeping everything sweet, he, quote, offers no challenge, actual or perceived, to the Talkenham pedestrians' values, end quote. In both cases, the mid-cult religion in Talkenham does not push listeners to new ideas or confront their own values in any meaningful way. Agreeable religion and ethics are the very things O'Connor tried to avoid in her own fiction. She famously claimed herself that if an audience does not hold the same beliefs as the artist, quote, you have to make your vision apparent by shock. To the hard of hearing, you shout, and for the almost blind, you draw large and startling figures, end quote. Schultz and Brittle both simply confirm what their congregants or readers desire most to hear. In Wiseblood, Hayes realizes this fact very early on when he first visits Talkenham. Even when rejecting any faith, he still holds a certain religious orthodoxy that exposes the mass cultural saturation of religion that he encounters in the city. His character serves as the dividing line between a true religion, according to O'Connor, of course, and one that has been diluted by consumerist tendencies. Separating mass cult, mid-cult cultural products from high art is the very thing MacDonald suggests in his essay on the subject. Rather than seeing mass culture as something that can be stopped, MacDonald proposes that there should be critics who are capable of sifting out high art from standardized cultural products. Hayes serves the exact same purpose, but with Christian religion. He's an embodiment of MacDonald's ideal critic. Though Motz's rejection of the Christianity in Motz's rejection of the Christianity in Talkenham, O'Connor makes it clear that without an orthodox faith, there's no possibility for depth, connection, or mystery in the surrounding world. As such, the need for individuals who can recognize the difference between an orthodox faith and mid-cult religion is essential in the consumer-driven society of post-war America. It is also important to note that MacDonald and O'Connor differ in many areas, one of which I want to point out briefly. MacDonald's view of art and mass culture is in some way exclusive. Few artworks and artists are included in the pantheon of true art. This view does not necessarily correlate to O'Connor's religion in Wiseblood, though most of the pedestrians we see in Talkenham find interest in a mid-cult Christianity. O'Connor shows us that her true view of religion is accessible to anyone. We see this at the end with Miss Flood. After Hayes blinds himself, Miss Flood slowly grows intrigued by the mysterious nature of his actions up until his very death. Here, I think, is the main difference between the two. MacDonald's artistic criticism suggests a closed-off barrier between mass culture and high art. In fact, he was even skeptical that the average American could ever move away from mass cult and mid-cult in favor of high art. O'Connor, though she is very critical of mass culture and a proponent of a particular form of Christianity, sees the barrier between her faith and mid-cult religion as something that can perhaps be bridged. That is, those caught up in mid-cult Christianity and mass culture generally can, like Miss Flood, experience the mysteries of a faith O'Connor so devoutly held. Thank you.
Okay, let's throw it open to see what kind of questions and comments anybody has about anything. You can raise your hand or you can type it out carefully in the chat, and I'll pass it along. And okay, I'll start with comments and questions. I swore I wasn't going to do this, but hey, I can't stand quiet. Carmen, what I want is, the details of the timeline for both of these authors. It's there's so many coincidences that, it makes me want to pin down when so-and-so was writing such and such. And, I don't know how to do that with the heathen manuscripts. I mean, I suppose that one could go through the letters and find places where Flannery's giving little hints about at what point she's writing a given bit of that book, but I don't remember seeing many dates on the manuscripts, and I'm really I really don't know about the details of Toole's composition. It's just, all those connections. It's just a fascinating topic, and if you can do any more detective work with it, I agree it's unknowable, but anything we can do you know, solve some of the mystery, that would be nice.
Well, Bruce, I'm interested in it too. And the best I can figure, I had kind of toyed with having this in there, but but it appears that they were working on these things simultaneously. I mean, in the exact same period of time. 62 is what, the Library of America, the collection there's got a timeline at the end of it. And I think it references that O'Connor was working on I think what they call a short story called Why the Heathen Rage. And I think it says she starts in 62. Now that seems a little late um, to me, but and maybe they're saying that stuff that came out of everything that rises must converge, because I know that your article talks a lot about having essentially cannibalized heathen for everything that came into that last collection of short stories. But Toole at that time is in Puerto Rico in the army, which is they identified as when he basically was his hottest writing time for Confederacy of Dunces.
Wow.
And then he continued it for several years afterwards. So it's really and I'm pretty sure I can identify it as it's going to be the exact same time. So I agree. That's something I'd like to continue with it and add some more detail there because there's another set of letters I think that's interesting that I'd like to pull in as well, which are the letters between Toole and Robert Gottlieb, who, I mean, they're just terrible. They're pitiful. And he's, because Gottlieb showed interest in the novel and, and said essentially, and this was right, this is around 62, 63, around the same period. And, he showed interest and said, well, if you could make these changes, and Toole's just pleading with him saying, I can't do anything else with this. This is what I've got. It's so close to me. I can't sort of fix it. And, so you just wonder if, flip that switch. And if that novel is published, gosh, suddenly you've got an entirely different author, an entirely different set of circumstances. So it's interesting. I think that Marion Burns talks about the comparison between the two letters. I think there's a lot more to do on the letters as well. I think there's a lot of reference to that. Although there's not as much of the actual letters in the heathen manuscripts. There's just sort of discussion of the letters, and so. So I don't know what more I can do with that, but I think there's more to be done, and I agree the timeline is really would help to drive it home a little more. So,
Does any of Toole's correspondence survive?
oh, it's those letters are out there. I've got copies of them, and they've been sort of portions of them been published in 2 or 3 biographies, but. When I was doing serious work on it years ago, I managed to get some facsimiles of the letters. So, I have them sort of in my possession, all those letters with him and Robert Gottlieb. And of course, Gottlieb doesn't really want to talk about it anymore, but it is a pretty terrible story when someone's novel's rejected. The person's pleading with you to say, please publish it the way it is. And you just kind of say no. And then the person kills himself and publishes and becomes very successful. So it's sort of it's not a happy story for anybody, so that's whence the topic of it is you wonder what may have been. You've got interestingly, you've got O'Connor, a published author with an unpublished novel, and you've got Toole, an unpublished author with a novel that's not published. So it's sort of a reversal there. But I want to ask you, Bruce, have you looked at this new Heathen that's come out?
Oh yeah, I read that, and it's really very interesting to see how Jessica Hooten Wilson puts it together and adds things. She writes an ending for the or a version of what the novel might have been, and she considers certain manuscripts by O'Connor part of heathen or influential on Heathen in ways that I hadn't
Hmm.
considered. And so, as I'm going through a book, there are moments when I say, "Oh, this is part of Heathen too."
Interesting.
I
Yeah.
can't say she's wrong, because I think everything's related to everything, and
Right. Sure.
so why not throw everything into the soup pot? I don't recall a whole lot of information about the timeline
Right.
that, when she was creating what. I think Jessica is thinking about, where was this going? What was it adding up to? And you can't do everything.
Interesting.
So
Well,
it'll continue
certainly.
to be an interesting topic. What else? Okay, Jack, here's my question for you. What about Ganga? What about all those movies that you said Mrs. Flood is somebody who's not exactly an intellectual, and she might be able to reach high art, or that realm that McDonald says is where you want to go. I would say that Enoch is spending all of his emotional energy on the trashiest of trashy movies, and yet what he comes up with out of it is totally weird and eccentric and personal. And I would say he's making a similar leap to what Mrs. Flood is. I never thought of making the claim that Enoch Emery is making a dive into high art at the end of his plot, or that's what's going to happen to him after the novel's over. But it just seems like a reasonable parallel to what's going on with Mrs. Flood at the end of the novel.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps I think that that's one way definitely to look at that. I think that the thing that I always want to make clear is, even though McDonald is talking about high art, I don't think that's necessarily what O'Connor's discussing in Wise Blood. I think just the idea of mid-cult, of something that's pretending to be what it's not, and religion and art is kind of the thing that I see in both happening in McDonald and in the Wise Blood novel. And so from that perspective, I see Enoch as looking for, like all the other kind of rural refugees to the cityscape, looking for some sort of connection with other people. And for him, it quite literally is mass culture that he thinks is going to get him there. And at the end, when he is Ganga, I'm not sure that gets him where he wants to go. Obviously, he tries to shake hands with that couple on the highway, and that doesn't work out for him. Of course, that's a very kind of standard reading of Enoch that other people have pointed out. But that's kind of the one that I see happening too. But maybe not, honestly. I think that it's kind of left up in the air at the end for sure.
Okay. So, let's say again that we're all going to be looking up Jack's article in Christianity Literature that, relates to what he's been talking about tonight.
Thank you.
Tom, you got your hand up. That's what that little yellow hand means, right?
Yes. I'm interested in this argument about possible connections between heathen and Confederacy of Dunces. And one thing that struck me is I have read Houghton Wilson's reconstruction of them. I'll just start by saying I do not find Walter's conversion at all convincing. Houghton Wilson speculates that O'Connor might have been influenced by J.F. Powers, who apparently said to her at one point, "You've got to stop killing off your characters. If you want to show people about Christianity, you need to show that they can actually become Christian or become Catholic and go with them." And that may be true, but it seems to me that the difference between what we see there and what we see in Toole's novel is that Ignatius is always fully formed as this bizarre, faux medievalist or whatever it is that we call him. I think that I wonder if something that might be interesting would be to ask, first of all, where would Toole have gotten the idea that somebody like this would be a compelling character and believable in some way, responding to something in the culture at this point? And I wonder if the thing to correlate it with, weirdly, would be to look through the letters and to trace O'Connor's changing attitudes towards Teilhard. And one of the reasons I say that is because you might remember, if we're going to look at Walter as in some ways a continuation of Asbury from The Enduring Chill, Asbury has that moment when he meets a priest, Father Fogel, I believe his name is, who gives him some kind of Teilhardian spiel. And at that point, Asbury seems kind of attracted to the idea. So if he goes from that to, as you say, a pre-Reformation Catholicism later, I wonder if that might parallel some changing in O'Connor's own theological thinking over time. But that was just something that came to mind. I don't know if there's anything in it or not, but it's something that occurred to me.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a fascinating idea, Tom. I hadn't thought about that, and I'm also kind of stuck on your idea, of Ignatius Riley as this fully formed character. I'm wondering where, where this comes from as well, because there's no conversion for him. I mean, he's, as you say, he's fully formed from the start of the novel to the end, which is probably one of the things that Gottlieb didn't like about this character. I mean, he's not someone who changes. He doesn't learn anything, that type of thing. Whereas I agree with you, Asbury does seem to learn. And I'm wondering if there's a way to make a parallel there. So yeah, thanks for that. I appreciate that. I think there's much more for me to explore here. So.
Yeah. I mean, and I can certainly agree that Walter, as I understand him, is still just getting going. That, you can question everything about him. Does he, who is this person? It's still, he still needs to crystallize, and it never quite gets there. As well as you expect, context. And I was like, oh yeah, he's not as interesting a character as Ignatius O'Reilly.
Yeah.
Ignatius is just this incredible thing for Walter to aspire to.
Do you remember, Bruce? There's a somewhere in the Heathen manuscripts, Walter actually becomes Julian. It's like his name switches to Julian shortly for a little while, and then there's sort of a version that she does calling him Julian.
Yeah, she uses lots of names here and there, and
Right.
she finally just starts calling him Walter a lot, but she considered all sorts of possibilities.
Yeah.
And I just think people are going to lose interest if we keep reminding them, oh, sometimes he's called this, and sometimes he's called that, and sometimes he's called the other. And I think if we want people to be interested, we just have to call him Walter and say, well, she was always heading. Okay, Heidi has a comment. And Heidi, I can't remember if you could unmute and say this, but I'll read it. I challenge a mashup with Ignatius and Hazel as they both try to start apocalyptic movements. The crusade for Moorish dignity and save the world through degeneracy and the Church of Christ without Christ. Would you care to elaborate?
Wow, now that's something I've never thought of before. That is pretty cool.
Yeah,
wow, I'll have to think about that. That is true. I mean, and when you picture Ignatius, I mean, it's everything with Ignatius. I mean, it's so absurd. But at the levee, factory, when he holds up the dirty sheet and he's trying to mobilize the workers and all, it certainly is. There are some similarities there. Yeah, I'm going to have to think on that one. But I appreciate the suggestion because I could see a lot of directions this could go. So I appreciate it.
What else, folks? Hmm. So everything is always a draft. We're always re-examining everything all the time and rethinking and adding and adding and adding and continuing the conversation and asking more questions we don't have time to get around to answers for. And I think you've successfully done quite a bit of all of that tonight. And unless somebody has something else they want to say, thank you. We'll declare victory and we will see you in the funny papers, folks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce. Thanks, Jack. Thanks, everybody.
Oh, thank you.